problems in learning, and then I have certain interests in general understanding. My field was philosophy of mathematics, so that occupies a little bit, but much more philosophy of mind, certain types of metaphysical problems, ethics. These are things that I try to keep up with more or less. So, I'll tell you something just a little interesting. One of the big mistakes is terminology. Artificial intelligence isn't intelligence, period. It's something that pretends or can produce the kinds of results that intelligence produces. It's not intelligence at all. So I tried out ChatGPT. ChatGPT was trained on millions and millions of sources up through 2021. But I know there are some things it doesn't know because I made them up. And they're not published anywhere. So I know it doesn't know them. So I asked him some of those questions which I made up and which I solved. And it was terrible. Absolutely terrible. Contradicted itself, didn't understand the question, didn't read the question correctly, and the reasoning that it presented was dopey. I mean, it was like, it's just not there. There's just nothing going on there. I wrote, in quotation marks, this sentence is true. Is it true or false? So, that's a liar paradox. This sentence is false, and if it's true, it's false, and if false, it's true, and it can't be one or the other. So I write back, wait a minute, I didn't write the sentence is false. I wrote the sentence is true. Yeah, it's a liar paradox. The liar paradox. So I said again, look again. I didn't say false. I said true. Oh, so sorry. I made a mistake. So I said, okay, so what about it? Is it true or isn't it true? This sentence is true. Is it true or not, right? It says back, it is true. I said, why? Because it says it's true. Oh, let me have your wallet, right? It's true because it says it's true. It couldn't be lying, couldn't be making a mistake. This is dopey. This is dopey stuff. There's no intelligence there. I have a bunch of other questions that I made up and I have answers to, So that's one of the problems that people are afraid. I want to put something in for the record. For those who are listening and all the rest, I've mentioned a number of times that emes doesn't mean true. I mentioned the fact that Rav Dessler has an essay on it. I found yesterday's Daf Yomi an explicit proof of it. So, if you find it in the Gemara, that makes you can't say someone else will say differently from Rav Dessler and who knows and play that kind of game. The Gemara says like this: when God pronounced the 10 pronouncements of Sinai, the first two are, I took you out of Egypt, and you should have no other gods before me. So those who heard it said, he's proclaiming for his own good. He wants to have control. He wants to have power. He wants everybody to honor and respect him. He's doing it just to build up his own position. But then when it came to the fifth commandment, which is honor your parents, so he's not keeping all the honor for himself. He wants other people to have honor. If so, then we admit that the first ones weren't egotistical in that way. Okay? I think we're going to bring several verses that it explains to be indicating that idea. And one of the verses is, Rosh Devaracha Emes. The beginning of your word is Emes. Meaning, the first two are the pronouncements of Sinai, which is the beginning of his word, where he says, I am God and should have no gods before me. That Rosh is Emes. Why is it Emes? Because we thought it was egotistical. We thought it was selfish. We thought it was building himself up. And now we see that it's not true because he also commanded that you should honor your parents. What does that got to do with true and false? It has nothing to do with true and false. At best, it's to do with morally appropriate, spiritually appropriate. That's not true and false. And it's from the verse that says, Rosh Devaracha, the beginning of your word is Emes. So there, the Talmud is understanding this verse where it says Emes does not mean true and false. I don't remember if that's bringing that, but that's open and shut. That Emes doesn't mean true and false. So I was very happy when I found that yesterday. Okay, so now we're on page 3 of chapter 8 in the handout. And we said that this life in the world to come is the reward. That's the reward for the person. Okay, page 4. How many metaphoric terms have been used to refer to the world to come? In the Psalms and in Isaiah, there are poetical references to the world to come. The mountain of God, His holy place, the holy path, the courtyards of God, the pleasantness of God, the tent of God, the palace of God, the house of God, the gate of God. These are all references because they talk about what's going to happen. Ultimately, talk about the ultimate reward. They are all ways of describing or referring to the world to come. And this fits with the general idea that I told you that while the soul is in this world, it loses touch with directly spiritual ideas, and they have to be explained through the physical experiences that the person has. So that being the case, these are all physical references, and they're supposed to give some representation, some analogy to the what the experience will be there. The example I like to give to explain this point is, we are told that Shabbos is me'ein olam haba. Me'ein olam haba means that Shabbos is of the same category, of the same dimension as olam haba. Now, using some rabbinic ideas, I want to create a parable for that. Let's suppose we consider a fish which is always in water. Could you explain to a fish what fire is? I think it'll be hard. Certainly you can't give him a demonstration of the water. But suppose you heat up the water and you say to the fish, fire is something like that. Something like that. Now imagine the fish equipped with an aqualung, through which it breathes water while it strolls on the land, and it goes investigating. Well, it won't mistake a stone for fire. It won't mistake water for ice cream for fire. It won't mistake wood for fire. If it comes across fire, it will feel the heat and say, "Oh, I remember that. Yeah, I remember when the water was like that." So the experience of heat in water is not bad as an indicator of what fire is like. Of course, it leaves a lot out. There's no combustion. You don't use up fuel and all the rest. But as an indicator, it's relevant enough to create ability to identify. Something like that goes on in this world. The physical descriptions that are used are not just arbitrary alternatives. They're supposed to communicate something where your attitude and experience of the physical things would be in some way indicative of your attitude and experience of the world to come when it comes. Of course, it won't be identical, it won't be exact, it doesn't have the description of the content and the mode of interactions, but there's something to it. That's why this phraseology is chosen. But the essence of it, just like a fish cannot know what fire is while it's in water, so we're not going to have that kind of experience here. Now, he then says, the sages referred to this good to prepare for the righteous with a metaphor, the feast. I think you could see that the sages' description, on the one hand, and the description of the verses are really very different. The verses describe something that is with God. And the world to come means being in His environment, being in His place. Speaks of pleasantness, it must be joyful, pleasant to be there, but all of them are being in His place. They don't describe anything about what we're doing in His place. Here, the sages are taking it to an entirely different dimension. What's happening to us there? Well, we're sitting at a feast. Now, I think what the sages are doing here is supplementing what you have in the verses. Because the verses describe being in a different context, in a different environment, which of course is exactly right. Now, what happens when you're sitting at a feast? Well, first of all, generally you're hungry. You want the food. You expect to experience pleasure in eating the food and also nutrition. Now imagine a person is working on a problem. Let's try to make it democratic. He's got a problem with another person, a relationship problem, and it hurts him, and he's worried about it. And somebody says, oh, you have that problem, that relationship problem? So-and-so is an expert. Go to that person, and very likely he'll be able to help you solve it. With what attitude would he go? Oh, boy, I hope this is right. If he can solve this problem, that would be wonderful. Will he listen carefully, do you think? Or will he be distracted? Will he be checking his emails while he's listening? Probably not, because he's worried about it. He wants this. He's anticipating happiness from it. He's anticipating a sense of support, a sense of relief. So here you have an attitude similar to a feast in something that isn't physical. It's intellectual. But the attitude of the feast, which I described before, is transferred. You want it, you're hoping for it, you're expecting to enjoy it, and expecting for it to sustain you. So that attitude can be transferred also to, as he said in the previous page, Neheni mizir hashchina, enjoying the shine of God's radiance, can be transferred to that area as well. But again, you're starting with a physical description and you're transferring it to a spiritual environment. That's what the rabbis are doing here. I think it's striking that the rabbis are speaking in a different dimension from the verses. Now, I haven't cataloged all the verses there are, and it could be that there are some verses like that. I'm just talking about what the Rambam brings here. Okay, paragraph 5. The retribution beyond which there is no greater retribution is that the soul will be cut off and not merit this life. As it states, the soul shall surely be cut off, his sin shall remain upon him. In other words, these words imply that there are other retributions. There are other punishments. It's just that this is the greatest of all of them. If you remember, he said prior that some transgressions are punished in this world only, some are punished in the next world only, and some are punished in both. And only divine justice knows which there are. But whatever punishments there are, being cut off from the world to come is the worst. This refers to the obliteration of the soul, which was referred to by the prophets with the following metaphoric terms: the pit of destruction, obliteration, the bonfire, the leech. All the synonyms for nullification and destruction are used to refer to it, again, because these are physical ideas, for it is the ultimate nullification after which there is no renewal, the ultimate loss which can never be recovered. Now, there is a great disagreement on this subject. The Rambam says in many places, and he never dilutes it in any way, that there is such a thing as the obliteration of a soul, or the annihilation of a soul. The Ramban, Nachmanides, says that can't be. The soul will never be obliterated. Now, the Ramban has a couple of points of description here which are necessary to grasp the idea altogether. First of all, he says there are descriptions of the soul being burned in fire and ground to dust. So first of all, he says, that's not annihilation. Annihilation means you cease to exist. If you say, I took a bar of iron and I burned it in fire and ground it to dust, that's not annihilation because you have the dust. Annihilation would just mean disappears. Number one. Number two, when the rabbis describe people as not having a share in the world to come, he says the same thing. If a soul is annihilated, wouldn't the question of its share in the world to come become vacuous? There's nobody there to have it, right? So you wouldn't have to say, first of all, I want you to know that it's annihilated. And in addition to being annihilated, I want you to know that it loses its share in the world to come. It isn't there. It doesn't exist. So its having a share in the world to come doesn't arise. So if that's the case, if the Mishnah says they don't have a share in the world to come, that sounds like they're not annihilated. Because if they were annihilated, you should tell me they're annihilated, and then you don't have to tell me anything else. So the Ramban says, number one, that our sources don't indicate annihilation. Now the Ramban says another thing. There are rabbinic sources that say the soul is burned in fire. And there are people who objected in his time. What do you mean? A fire can't burn a soul. A soul isn't wood. So those sources either are mistaken or they mean something else or whatever it is, but they can't be right because fire applies only to physical objects. So Ramban says, God, who made the soul, could create a fire to burn it up with also. It's not out of his capability of destroying the thing that he made. You worry if you call it fire or not, it'll be enough like fire to deserve the term. So, there's no limits to what God can do. So now when the Ramban says that souls aren't obliterated, they aren't annihilated, you have to know where he's coming from. Why not? If God can create a fire that burns it up, makes it into ash or dust, couldn't God annihilate it? And the answer has to be, yes, he could. So if the Ramban is telling me that they won't be annihilated, he means it's not God's policy to annihilate. Not because it's impossible. Ramban says exactly that. It's not God's policy to annihilate a soul. And he brings a proof for it, which I find astonishing. He says, nothing in the physical world is annihilated. Things only change form. Absolute confirmation of mass energy or something. Confirmation. Nothing gets annihilated. I wonder how he knew that. That's not obvious. When you burn a piece of wood, the thing weighed 10 pounds, and now you have some smoke and water vapor. Isn't a lot of it gone? Doesn't it look like it's gone? Surely some of it's missing. That's what you would think. How did he know that nothing in the physical world gets annihilated? I don't know how he knew that. And he just says it as a fact. And he says, if the physical world is conserved, surely the spiritual world should be conserved. The spiritual world is infinitely greater and more important than the spiritual. So it's not going to be God's policy to annihilate a soul. What then did the rabbis mean when they said that some have no share in the world to come? To have a share means to take a certain place in the world to come and to have a certain relationship to the world to come. Now he recites that, the Gemara I mentioned before, that the souls of certain terrible, terrible people, 1,000th of 1%, are burned up in fire and ground to dust and sprinkled beneath the feet of the righteous. And again he says, that's not a description of annihilation. You can't both cease to exist and also be sitting under the feet of the righteous. You can't have both of those. So if it said that they're sitting under the feet of the righteous, it must be they're not annihilated. But it means that they aren't there as subjects that receive the world to come on their own. They become an adjunct to others who receive the world on their own, the world to come on their own. And thereby they can have a secondary, perhaps, participation in it, but they don't get it as themselves. That's what it means they don't have a chelik. They don't have a share that's written with their name on it. This is the one that's for you. They didn't earn it. Indeed, what they earned was not having one. But that doesn't mean they're not there. There's such a thing as being there without having a share written for you. So this is the difference between the Rambam and the Ramban. Ramchal, and you hear me quote the Rambam and Ramchal a lot because they're the two that I have studied the most. Ramchal, difficult for us, takes both positions. Some places, like in the Derech Hashem, he says souls can be destroyed. And some places, like in the Pischei Chochmah V'das, he says souls cannot be destroyed. I have asked Ramchal scholars about this. Is there a way of reconciling it? Did he change his mind? Did he come to a fixed opinion, at the end? So we could say that was his final opinion, and nobody could give me an answer. So I don't know what to say about it. I just know that some sources yes, some sources no. Yeah, man.
So for the Ramban, there is a concept of certain eternal condemnation for the soul. Like it's like it reaches to a place in which it's eternally under certain consequences of what it performed in the world, but stays with those. I'm
not sure. In the passage that I'm quoting, he does not say that soul is suffering. Okay. He just says that that soul's access to the world to come is secondary, dependent upon something else. It could be that the positive aspects of the world to come are mostly shut off from it. So that what it gets from the positive is minimal. But whether it's in pain, that I don't know. The Rambam said explicitly, and many others agree, that the world to come is all good. That seems that would rule out pain altogether, because pain is not good. Did the Ramban ever say that? The sources that I found that say that there could be eternal pain are very few. That's a small minority position. I spoke about justifying it because it's one of the positions of the tradition. So I wanted to see if I could understand it. But Rambam definitely rules it out, and I don't remember, I'm not as fluent in the Ramban as I am in the Rambam, so I've never heard of him taking such a position. Yeah.
Something like Gehenna.
Yeah.
Like how does that play into this?
So I've never heard the Rambam describe the Gehenna, but for the vast majority of sources, Gehenna is a way of removing the consequences of one's transgressions. That has an effect on the soul. Now, if you take this part of the Rambam's idea that there's no punishment, so then it's not punishment. It's just rehabilitation. But the usual idea is that the limit in Gehenna is a year. That's why, if you lose a parent, you say Kaddish for a year minus 1 month. Minus 1 month is because I don't want to imply that my parent needed the whole year. That's a little brutal to do that. But I want to give my parent the maximum benefit of the fact that I'm saying Kaddish, so it's done for 11 months. But the idea is that after the year's over, it's over. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better to err on the side of caution and say their name for the whole year, just in case?
I don't know. I mean, err on the side of caution. I didn't say their name. I talked about saying Kaddish, but that's not what you're saying. I don't know. What is done for them and in their name is something that they experience. So the idea of implying the possibility that they were so vicious that they need the whole year is something that they sort of could be embarrassed about. So how to make that exact calculation, I mean, only those who have some feedback from that state of being could make that calculation. I hear the point. You question? No, I thought you had a question. Okay. So this is the ultimate retribution. And after that, there's nothing. It's absolute annihilation. After that, there's nothing. Okay, yeah.
So when it comes to these very vivid descriptions, are these coming from prophets who were able to communicate with the other side, or how do we, where is it coming from?
So I think prophets are people who get inspiration from God. They're not magic makers. They don't use they don't communicate with dead souls and sorts of things. That God inspires them in certain ways, either gives them direct words or inspiration, and they communicate what God wants communicated. But again, what are they communicating? They're communicating physical descriptions which give some indirect indication of what it's like, just like heating up the water for the fish. Because their descriptions are physical. That's all it is. So you're not getting raw what the world to come is like. Now, I'll give you another example, which is in some Sfarim, and I think it's very vivid. It gives you an idea of, I'm not saying this is the whole thing or 10% of the thing, but there's one which is concrete that you can think of. when the person dies, first thing that happens is the soul gets total amnesia. And then the soul is given access to view its whole life, not knowing that it is the one it's viewing, because it has total amnesia. And the soul is asked to pass judgment on the actions that it observes. Now, you know very well, when you think about what you have done, you are subject to enormous bias, both positive and negative. Some people are really down on themselves, and they're thinking about the fact that their motivation wasn't 100% pure, and I'm really selfish, and we go and so on and so on. And other people make excuses for themselves and think they're victims, and so on and so on, right? All that's cut out, because the soul now doesn't recognize that it's him. So he passes judgment, and then memory is restored. Wow. Now I have to look at that thing that I did without any rationalizations, without any excuses, because I myself passed judgment on it as if it were somebody else. And I didn't award them with rationalizations and excuses. So that means facing yourself with total honesty, total objectivity. And that means, for a normal person's life, some of it's going to be very painful. When we think about our past history, and especially this time of year, I think the phraseology that comes to mind almost constantly is, yes, but I did it. Yeah, that's right. I should have done it. But I was under pressure, but I really didn't know, but I had very little experience, but all sorts of buts. And then I'd say, okay, so it wasn't so bad. No, don't get too excited. It wasn't too bad. When you have that experience, which is one of the ways to describe Gehenna, where there's no but, because it's not you, that's a different story. And then when memory is filled in and you have to have all the yeses and none of the buts, that's a different experience. Mm-hmm. Now you probably have had already, even though you're young, things that you've done, you think back on, you had that cringe. Oy, why did I do that? I shouldn't have done that. And that could stay with you for life. And nothing wrong with that, nothing bad about that. But that cringe that you feel is together with all your buts. Now imagine all the buts evaporated. You look back on it. It can be devastating, and that's right. It should be devastating. That pain of devastation is part of the rehabilitation. That means you're dealing with it, like they say in psychology, you're dealing with it. Okay, you're dealing with it. Yeah.
So the authoritative power of the Sanhedrin, when it existed, was supposed to be very important and held to a high regard. So if there was a prophet who wanted to do something against the Sanhedrin, or defy the wishes of the Sanhedrin, which one would, basically, would he go with what the rabbis say, or would he go with what God says, or with...
Good. So that's actually illustrated in the Gemara, the famous Gemara, where it says there was a disagreement about a certain point of law, and in the Sanhedrin there was two parties to the disagreement, and it was as lopsided as possible. Rabbi Eliezer was on one side, and everybody else was on the other side. It was 70 against 1. So you could sort of predict how the vote will go. But because Rabbi Eliezer was a great scholar, they wanted to try to reach some accommodation. So they had a little extended debate. And neither side budged. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer, realizing that 1 against 70 isn't going to win, used some, I would say, unique and imaginative forms of argumentation. He said, if I'm right, let this tree get up and walk 50 paces. And it did. Rabbi Yeshua, representing the majority, said, trees have no authority in a legal discussion. So he said, if I'm right, let the water in this stream flow uphill. And it did. Rabbi Yeshua said, sorry, water is out of line, out of commission, out of court. So he said, if I'm right, let the walls of the house of study move inwards, sort of collapse inwards. And they did. And Rabbi Yeshua yelled at the walls and said, how dare you interrupt the discussion of the sages. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer played his trump card. He said, if I'm right, let a voice from heaven proclaim that I'm right. There you are. more than a prophet, right? Both voice from heaven. Eliezer is right. What did Yeshua say? The Torah is not in heaven. So you think, what? If Yeshua is going to play even against God? How could he say the Torah is not in heaven? The answer is, God said it. He's quoting him word for word. It says in the book of Deuteronomy, Lo b'Shamayim. He's quoting God against God. He says to God, you told us that the Torah is not in heaven. That means you gave up your authority to intervene in a discussion of the sages. To which God said, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me, in laughter. That's what he told them. So that means that when the verse of Deuteronomy says, Lo b'Shamayim, it means no interjection from heaven can play any role in a sage's communication, a sage's discussion. And therefore, if a prophet, an even established prophet, comes to the Sanhedrin and says, cancel the discussion, guys, I know the answer, that's a capital crime. He'll be executed. Because Moses told us that God doesn't interfere in those things. Now, here you have to be very careful. It isn't that the prophet is disqualified from making contribution. It's that the prophet is disqualified from claiming the authority of prophecy to make his contribution. If the prophet wants to say, gentlemen, I want to join the debate, fine, come in, have a cup of coffee, let's go through it, right? And even if he says, listen, here's an argument for one side, which God told me, but the others are free to disagree, that's fine also. After all, where do you think you get your brilliant ideas from? Right? Isn't a large part of it God's gift to you? You can't be disqualified to say, I got this from God, so you got it from God. So what? Put it on the table and we'll all talk about it. And if you can convince us, fine. If you can't convince us, that doesn't carry any authority. So the authority of the Sanhedrin in that respect trumps that of a prophet, and certainly trumps that of a king. The Sanhedrin is really the highest power.
Wow.
Okay. However, I should just say that the Sanhedrin is fallible. In the Mishnah in Horayos talks about what happens when they make a mistake. What are the consequences if they make a mistake? You'll tell me, how do you know they made a mistake? Well, a later Sanhedrin disagrees. You'll tell me, but that only means one of them made a mistake. How do we know which one made a mistake? The answer is, you don't need to know. God said, follow the latest decision of the Sanhedrin. That's what you're supposed to follow. That's what you're supposed to do. So you step back and say, well, then one of them has to be wrong. That may be correct. One of them has to be wrong. You don't have to know which one is wrong, because in the interim, you are duty-bound to follow the first decision also. That's what you had to do. Even though the second Sanhedrin is saying the first Sanhedrin is wrong. Here the Sanhedrin is not legislating. They can legislate, but that's not what they're doing now. They're deciding a case that's on the books. And when they decide the case of the book, they're deciding this is the halacha that must be followed. And if a person followed the decision of the previous Sanhedrin, there may be readjustments to what he did that have to be made, because it's not just from now on. It's retroactively. But he's not guilty. He followed the Sanhedrin, he's not guilty. He's certainly innocent, and he could be a tzaddik. So it's a little bit of a complex system. There is one other way to know the Sanhedrin is wrong. And there's actually, in the Mishnah Horayos says what happens if one of the sages knows they're wrong, and doesn't explain how he could know that. But here's a way that it could be done. The Mishnah reports a disagreement between Hillel and Shammai about a certain law, certain measure for doing something, and two weavers who sat at the gate of Jerusalem came and said, we witnessed Shmai Avtalion, who were Hillel and Shammai's teachers, discussing this law, and he gave they gave a third measurement against both Hillel and Shammai. So the Sanhedrin said, okay, so then we reject Hillel, we reject Shammai, because their teachers were greater than they, and we'll settle the law like Shmai Avtalion. Okay. Suppose now the Sanhedrin comes to a conclusion about something, and I know that Shmai and Avtalion said differently. Well, if I go and tell this to Sanhedrin, first of all, they could say, you're only one, not two. We need two eight witnesses. And they might not trust me. I'm not a great scholar. I'm not one of their level. But I know they're wrong. Because I know what Shmaya and Naftali said. And I know that if they had access to what Shmaya and Naftali said, they would change their minds. I know that. They just don't have access. Or maybe I'm sitting in Tveria, they make the decision in Jerusalem, and it's now publicized, and I'm not there to talk to them. I just know that they're wrong. So it is possible to know that they're wrong. But in the meantime, I have to do what they say. Because they have to follow the decision of the Sanhedrin. So it's the question of the lines of authority are very clearly delineated in these cases. The Torah system has its laws and its meta-legal principles, the principles by which laws are made, by which laws are changed, by which laws are discarded. It has meta-legal principles. Also, they're also parts of the legal tradition. Yeah.
So in the modern Jewish world, when we come to different halachic rulings, and there's so many new things that we just have to figure out, okay, what do I do? How similar is it to the Sanhedrin process?
It has a gigantic difference because the Sanhedrin process, they voted when they could. They didn't. It's not true they always could vote. When they voted, and when they voted, it was over. And every rabbi in the world had to follow it. Today, there's no voting. You cannot compel the minority to do according to the majority. That's a position only in the Sanhedrin. The Satmarav, the Chazal Bracha, was very, very sensitive to this and opposed any institution that apes the Sanhedrin, pretends as if you had a Sanhedrin, a kind of pseudo-Sanhedrin. There's an umbrella organization of many Orthodox groups called Agudas Yisrael, and they have leading committees, and the decisions there are taken by vote. And he was against that. He said, you're pretending you have a Sanhedrin. You're imitating the method of Sanhedrin. It's not true. So they were also great scholars and great tzaddikim, and they disagreed with him, but you can see where he's coming from. You can't compel the minority to do according to the majority. Yeah.
So what are the reasons that God brings prophets?
So the Maimonides said that he brings prophets for giving the people information. If you do this, that, and that will happen. To exhort them to do better, warn them of the penalties that they could possibly face if they continue to do the bad things that they're doing. And on occasion, a prophet has the authority to tell people to violate the laws of the Torah on a one-time basis or on a temporary basis. Just like the court has that authority, the prophet has that authority as well. except for idol worship, where he doesn't have the authority. For other things, so for example, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, which was a very widespread idol-worshipping sect in the First Temple period. He planned to challenge them to a contest to bring fire from heaven, and he built an altar, and they built an altar, and they put a sacrifice on the altar, and of course their antics didn't produce any fire from heaven. And when Elijah, after that, did come down, and he offered a sacrifice in the Carmel Mountains. Well, once the temple was built in Jerusalem, you can't do that. That's against the law. That's Kabbalas Chutz, Shchutei Chutz. But since he's a prophet, he has that authority.
But only on a one-time basis.
That's
so
right.
It can't be for one period of time. It has to be literally once.
No, it could be for a period of time.
How long?
For example, conducting a war. He could say, go to war with this nation and fight the war on Shabbos. And it may take years. But it's got to be limited. It can't be forever. Because to make it forever would be like to legislate it. Once Moses is finished, there's no more legislation. There can be rabbinic legislation, but there's nothing that carries the force of biblical legislation. And the prophet, we are told by the Torah to do what the prophet says. For him to make it permanent would be violating what the Torah says. That's the rough, yeah.
Is the only way to determine if someone's a true prophet is for them to predict something and for it to happen?
There are three or four criteria that a person has to make to verify that he is a prophet. First of all, he has to be a great sage. Can't be an ignoramus. Second of all, he has to be a great tzaddik. He has to be fulfilling the Torah in an extreme degree. Third of all, he has to claim it. He has to say, God spoke to me. And fourth of all, he has to do something that transcends nature. So it often is predicting the future in certain ways, but anything else that he could do would also satisfy. And the reason why these are the criteria for accepting someone as a prophet, because Moses said so.
Wow.
Moses' authority is independent. We all heard God speaking to Moses. That's explicit in chapter 19 of the book of Exodus. Pick it out and read it. God says, I'm going to come to you in the heavy cloud, and I will speak to you, and they will hear me speaking to you, so that they will believe in you forever. That happened once. That happened with Moses. Moses told us God wants us to accept a person as a prophet if he fulfills these criteria. And indeed, Maimonides, who's so careful about these things, says all we know when these criteria are fulfilled is that the laws that Moses gave us told us to accept him as a prophet. We don't know that he is a prophet. Just like he says, if you have a judge and he's hearing a case, a criminal case, and there are witnesses who say that they saw the accused perform the crime, and the judges go through the normal cross-examination, and the witnesses survive the cross-examination, then the law is you punish him. Says Maimonides, the judges don't know that he did it. All they know is that the legal requirements for punishing him have been met, and therefore the right thing to do is to punish him. They don't know that it happened. Similarly, we don't know that Isaiah was a prophet. We know that Moses' rules told us to accept him as a prophet. Now, most people think, okay, if Moses' rules and nothing came up that contradicted, so forth and so on, it's not a wild assumption that he was a real prophet. But the basis that we have for doing it is not something that verifies to us that he was a prophet. The basis for doing it is that the laws that Moses gave us told us to accept him and relate to him as a prophet. Okay, we'd straight a little bit. I want to tell you what the basic problem in chapter 9 is, and we'll pick it up on Tuesday, I guess. The Rambam said at least 16 times that the reward is the world to come, and the punishment is being cut off for the world to come. What are we supposed to make of the many, many verses, scores of verses, maybe even hundreds, in the Torah that say, if you fulfill my commandments, then things will go well with you in this world. Peace and prosperity, or very rarely is it peace. It's more, conquering your enemies and being invulnerable to your enemies, and long life and health. And what's that? In Shema, the second paragraph of Shema, you have it. Say it twice a day. If you live up to my laws, then things will be good. Well, plentiful harvests. If you don't live up to my laws, then you'll be punished. You go into exile. If reward and punishment really are what happens in the world to come, what is the status of these predictions? And by the way, the Rambam, when he says the reward in the world to come, is quoting a passage in the Talmud. The Gemara says the word schar b'hayam aleika. Reward in this world doesn't exist. So a job has to be done to figure out what those verses mean. That's basically the subject of chapter 9. And we'll get that next week in Yisrael Hashem. So listen, daven well on Rosh Hashanah, and we should be able to get a grip on ourselves and look forward to an upward path of understanding and commitment and focus and accomplishment.
Amen.